I'm very excited today to introduce Gabby Pimstone. Gabby's a specialist in organizational change, culture, transformation, facilitation, and leadership. So, welcome, Gabby, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Cara. It's fantastic to be here.
I'm really excited about this chat, and I note that, or you've a little extension on the intro, you have 30 years of experience in helping organizations and individuals read the patterns and defaults that direct how people move through change,
Mm,
including with major banks and consultancies. And one thing I really love about your approach is your focus on the unseen and underlying dynamics that shape lasting transformation, which we'll
yeah.
dive into more today.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds kind of obvious when you talk about it, and a lot of people just talk about it. But what I have experienced in the world of work is most of it is lip service. When you actually get down to brass tacks, a lot of the transformation that's happening is around what you can see, the visible aspect of change. So, restructuring technology, but actually not really diving into the operating system underneath all of that.
And that is so important when we're talking about long-lasting change as well, as opposed to change that just happens on the surface. And
Exactly.
yeah, I'm curious actually how you introduce yourself because I feel like this is sometimes language that isn't necessarily, it's not necessarily the norm in the change discipline or transformation or even with culture. How do you introduce yourself and what you do and who you support?
Well, I like to simplify it. I would say that I guide leaders. Sometimes it's teams and sometimes it's a whole organizational system. But I'm taking them through transformation that actually lands, as you
Mm,
alluded to, not short-term fixes, but making sure that whatever transformation they're going through, that it takes root and it spreads throughout the system. So that's like the simplest way that I can put it, because when you're just shuffling the deck chairs, it's it's like a lot of activity,
yeah.
but not real transformation. So the work that I do goes beneath the surface, goes beneath the waterline, and repatterns the organization so that whatever change they're going through, or in fact, in today's world where change isn't really project based, it's continuous, change is BAU,
Yes.
that the organization and its people have the capacity for change to take root, to continue, and to amplify.
Mm. And before we dive more into that, I'm really curious to talk a little bit more. We've touched on it briefly before, but how you became interested in change and transformation and entered into this space.
Well, it was a long time ago. um, I think my fascination with change started when I was a young girl, certainly before the age of 10. When I was 9, my father passed away. And he was sick for a number of years in the lead up to that. And that whole process sparked a deep curiosity in me about, how the human psyche navigates disruption, loss, change, whatever that disruption is. And at a really young age, Cara, I started working with my dreams, writing down my dreams and trying to understand what was happening out of my awareness and why the experience was so intense for me. And so when it came to studying at university, psychology was really just a natural extension of that exploration. It started young. Then later, when I began my career at a global consultancy, I was there for a number of years, strangely enough, a little bit of a fish out of water, but change was treated in a way I often say like a Macca's hamburger. The same recipe was applied no matter where you were in the world, no matter what industry you were working in, no matter what the organization was. And the paradigm was steeped in the assumption that expert knows best. So they would, sell neat methodologies and checklists, and it worked for some, but for me, I felt uneasy. I felt like something was missing. And then that changed when shortly after that, I was fortunate enough to work with two bosses in two separate companies who were mentors to me, and they gave me the space to explore a different approach and to kind of move away from the cookie cutter change and learn how to honor the uniqueness of each system and also how to hold the process of change. So it was kind of a, a number of personal things that pushed me into the field, but then I got extremely lucky with the organizations I worked with and the bosses I had.
And that makes such a big difference to you on the job. But it also sounds like, and I know this from our previous chats too, that you bring together some really unique and interesting threads into how you see change and transformation, where I think we have quite a bit of overlap, especially around process work and how that allows you to get deeper into change. Could you share a bit more about what that means and how people can sort of explore that in their own, say, life or organization?
Well, I'm a process oriented psychology is the field of process work. It's one of my lenses, but I think it informs, you're right, it's a different angle on the topic of change. And to be fair, not every organization wants this, but those who do really benefit from it. I mean, at, I guess the best way that I can describe it is thinking about helping an organization through change in the same way you would if you were supporting a woman through childbirth, right? You know, a midwife or a doctor can't stick to a rigid formula. Every birth is going to be unique. And the same is true of transformation. So you got to be really alive to that. And what I focus on are two layers that we need to work on. One is the culture of the organization itself, the invisible rules, assumptions, and beliefs that shape how people operate. And the other is what I call the meta process of change, which is an invisible cycle that every system goes through when it transforms. Think of it like a default response when disruption hits, and both need conscious attention.
So the meta process of change and the culture.
Yes, those two. Now, culture matters. I think this is probably a little bit more intuitive for your listeners. It matters because it holds those hidden assumptions and those shape how people think and how they behave. And once you bring those out into the open, it becomes really clear what needs to change, what mindset needs an upgrade. So it takes you beyond just what systems are we implementing, but what's the attendant mindset with that. So I'll give you an example. I worked with an organization who had made, this was years ago, made a really high profile mistake, very public, and they'd launched an initiative to rebuild public trust. That's when I came in. What was interesting is they were building external trust, public trust with external stakeholders, but internally they were governed by a belief of mistrust. And the belief was this: if we don't tightly control everything and everyone, we're going to be betrayed or exploited or harmed. And in a sense, the underlying assumption was that trust equals naivete. And that unspoken assumption meant that while they were promising openness and transparency to the public, to the outside world, inside they were second guessing one another, and the culture was fundamentally out of alignment with that change that they were trying to pursue. And of course, it was difficult. So that's the culture piece. The meta process is an entirely different one and something that very few organizations understand and explore, but that's where you unlock serious transformation.
And how does that sort of tie in with what you mentioned before of, we're on the same page that change can no longer really be managed on a project basis because it's really just an ongoing, as you said, BAU
Yeah.
activity, but also process. So how does that, when we look through the lens of the meta process, how what can we learn from that in terms of how we look at or facilitate change in an organization?
That's a great question. So, if change is BAU, if disruption is BAU, it's just all the time, okay? What you need to know, and this is what the meta process is that every system has a default way of responding to disruption, no matter what that disruption is. It could be AI, it could be just, ongoing instability in the economy or in the marketplace. It could be whatever the disruption is. So when that's happening all the time, it's even more important to understand that rhythm, because what it means is if you know what that rhythm is, if you know what the meta process is, it can give you a more accurate map for guiding change. It can inform how you bring change into the organization rather than imposing a theoretical framework. So you're building a default muscle. So what you're doing is you're looking at their default muscle. You're saying, is this working or isn't it? And if it isn't, and then you're helping them build an inherent muscle for going with a more natural process of change as opposed to resisting it. Let me give you an example, right? So in one organization that I worked with for about a year, their meta process, their internal kind of default way of responding to disruption was to point fingers. It's them, not us, right? So transformation projects focused outwards, but whenever the mirror turned inwards, resistance shut the project down. Every single change initiative was abandoned midway, including the one that I was on. Didn't crack that nut. In another organization, the inner posture, the meta process was born of trauma that the organization had had years before. They nearly collapsed at one point, and that trauma created a culture of extreme risk aversion, extreme. So their meta process of change, their way of going through change became reactive, and they could only tolerate incremental change. So the moment real risk entered the picture, transformation shut down. So you can see how understanding that inner posture, that inner stance, that default response to change itself can determine, really does shape how you go about introducing change or helping them manage change in the broader sense in the system.
And who is best placed to, for in your risk example, ideally over time, it would benefit the organization for them to have a bit more balance in their risk approach. Who is best placed to help shape or change or evolve the meta process? Because obviously, or from my perspective, it sounds like, getting people in from the outside, there's only so much that they can do. And because it's a system, we need people within it sort of
Yeah,
making that
yeah.
change. So if you're coming in to support them, who do you really look to, or what processes or threads do you really look to pull in order to help shape that meta process?
It's a great question. And to be honest, in that example, I was an internal practitioner.
Ah,
It
perfect.
was a permanent role. I was heading up the whole OD function in that bank, which made it infinitely easier, infinitely. So who did I work with? I worked with the CEO and the ELT. And then, we'd had some robust conversation there, and then went to the top 250, 300, and then we actually filtered the conversation to 8,000 leaders across the bank. And that's how the system shifted, like that tipping point. But in more general terms, you would need a really, really good internal OD function to be able to do that. A function that is able to hold the paradox of understanding the system. This was your point, knowing the people, knowing which levers to pull, but also having enough objectivity, neutrality, and marginality in that system to be able to step away from it, to be in it, but not of it, if that makes any sense. And, that is the work then is to work with internal OD functions to help build that muscle. But ultimately, you are doing it with the senior leadership because it's
Mm.
about an inner posture. And I've not necessarily seen in organizations I'm just trying to think, have I ever seen, I've seen inside out change happen, like from the middle, outwards, but I haven't seen grassroots change in an organizational setting. And in the case of this particular organization, it made sense for the top team to emulate and model and really get to grips with this.
Mm. And I think, as you said, the modeling and the role modeling of leadership has such a big impact on culture, especially in an organization. So it makes sense that, the leadership are really the ones who are setting the template for how we behave, what the culture is, and how to sort of lead that transformation.
You're
Um,
absolutely right. And I mean, it was my hero, the person that I'm most inspired by professionally is Professor Edgar Schein from MIT. I actually studied under him. And he has a number of definitions of leadership. And one of them is leadership is the management of culture. I remember him saying in a class once, the only important thing that a leader does is to manage or evolve the culture as needed. And so it really does. I mean, that's a timeless principle and it hasn't changed. It's still because people learn in two ways, don't they, Cara? They learn through trial and error, but they also learn through mimicking people in positions of influence. And that's where leadership comes in.
Mm. And I love how you say that because I think also the way that what came to mind was, you know, the culture is a structure that people can operate within, and that sort of imprints or influences what kind of behaviors are accepted, and even very, very, very subtly, and also opening up new avenues that people might not have felt able to explore as well. So that culture, even though I think culture tends to be thought of as more of a soft area, it's actually a bit of a structure in terms of holding and containing how people are showing up in an organization.
Yes. I just want to, so when you say structure like a boundary, like a container, right? Is that what you mean?
Yes, yes,
I
absolutely.
agree wholeheartedly with that. And you're so right when you say, sorry, my plug just keeps coming out.
It's okay.
So one of you, you're right when you say it's actually can be very subtle because one of the ways that culture is transmitted in a really subtle way in organizations through leadership is what leaders pay attention to, what they measure, what they control, what becomes the focus in meetings. And those things are kind of almost every day. You don't really notice those. But when you do tune in, you start to get a really good sense about what they're transmitting and what matters to them, what they value. And so it's happening like through a process of osmosis all the time. And therefore there is no way around the fact that the primary embedding mechanism for culture and also for this meta process of change is the leadership role.
Mm. And I
That's
think,
my view.
no, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And I think, it's sometimes we do. I personally find myself wanting to move away a little bit from too much hierarchy or thinking, oh, there can be more culture built up from the bottom. But ultimately, in the way that organizations are structured and based on power dynamics within an organization and decision making and prioritization and strategy, it is the leaders that do have that influence and that power to shape the culture of an organization. And that's something that is done either very intentionally, or if there's not as much awareness, it's done anyway based on how people show
Exactly.
up.
Exactly. And I think what you're saying is so important in that if you think of it this way, leadership, it's not a hierarchy. I just wrote, it's the container, to your
Mm,
point.
yes.
And I'm trained, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Tavistock
No.
model. It's a beautiful kind of way of addressing group process, but I'm trained in that way. And one of the underpinning principles there, which you see in groups all the time, is that people expect and they want and they need leaders to provide clarity, to provide direction, to role model, etc. When they don't, it creates anxiety in the system. And, talking about containment, one of the roles of a leader is to contain anxiety during transformation, and
Mm.
therefore they have to be present because their presence acts as a container for anxiety.
I love that you brought up presence. I think that's something that is again maybe misunderstood or not necessarily talked as much about in leadership spaces, but it is such a powerful sort of force in change in leadership and management in general. I know
Yeah.
that I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on this one. I'd love to hear a bit more about your view on the role of presence here and also how people can cultivate that maybe a bit more in leadership. Like, what does that even mean to you?
Well, if I were to go back to the process work lens that we started with, because that's one of the ways that I view the world, how I would describe presence in that context is to differentiate between two things. So in any moment, say you're a leader, right? And you are giving feedback. Let's have you having a feedback conversation with someone. There are two things happening in that moment. You are deploying a skill and you're deploying what process work calls a meta skill. Now, the skill is knowing how to give feedback. There are principles for giving feedback. Time it correctly. Sometimes the sandwich technique is used. Whatever it is, okay. There's the skills, but the meta skill is the presence. So this is the attitude and that intangible quality that you bring to bear in the application of any skill or any technique. So in the example of giving feedback, the presence slash meta skill might be empathy. So that is going to determine people respond to the meta skill, they respond to the presence before they even respond to what you're doing. So the minute you walk into a room, a process is starting, and the same technique given with a different presence or a different meta skill is going to give you very, very different outcomes. So, an example of the feedback, if you are not delivering feedback with the presence of care and the presence of empathy, then it's going to fall flat. You can follow all the 5 steps, but same with change. You can follow any toolkit, but if you showing up as a leader without the meta skill of empathy, maybe courage, I don't know, there are various, the list goes on, maybe authenticity, whatever you're doing is going to fall flat. So the presence slash meta skill is actually the number one thing that people respond to when you're working with a system.
And those meta skills are really not necessarily highlighted in discussions around leadership and also how to apply them because empathy is used a lot and you hear that word a lot, but I guess what that really means in that presence and what it means to show up, and especially leaders very busy, pulled in a lot of different directions, and so there's that balance of being able to slow down, but also be in the weeds, but also seeing the strategy, as you mentioned before, being
Yes,
in
yes,
it, but not of it. And I think
yes,
those meta skills are really such an important conversation in the leadership and change and transformation toolkit for organizations, but I'd also argue for personal interactions and for yourself as
oh
well.
yeah, oh yeah. I mean, one of the elements of presence that is very tricky but so powerful when you master is what you're touching on, which is the ability to hold paradox,
Mm.
you know? And so when just knowing innately when to slow down or when to speed up, knowing innately what needs to be tended most to BAU or transformation. And so it's holding that tension, which is such an important part of transfer leading change and transformation. And it's a presence you bring. It's not anything you do, it's where your focus goes. It's how you engage with complexity. It's I guess the question is, can it be taught? And if so, in what way can it be taught? How do you develop such a kind of nebulous, how do you develop presence?
Mm.
Yeah.
And
Interesting
it is
question.
nebulous. It's so much harder to measure. There's no KPI on presence or
No.
empathy, or as you said, that ability to hold paradox and uncertainty and complexity is very, very difficult to measure, but so has such a profound impact on outcomes.
It really does. And that probably in what you've just said is one of the reasons why it's often ignored, because
Mm,
there's an obsessive desire to measure everything. And actually the the stuff that sits out of awareness, the stuff that's a little bit more tacit, may not necessarily be neatly measurable, but it has the greatest impact on the success or the failure of any change that you're going through.
mm. How does that then show up? I'm curious in terms of if we can contribute to raising awareness around this or evolving how we manage change and transformation, because as you said, change is becoming BAU. We need better ways to be able to manage it so that
Yeah.
we're not, in chaos all the time or leading to burnout, low morale, etc.
Yes.
What sort of ways do you think we can bring this into organizations in a way that is not too jarring, sort of easing it in, but allowing these meta skills and these other elements to really help support transformation?
Well, they may not be neatly measurable, but there are very tangible benefits that I think
Mm.
people would viscerally understand. We've got to start introducing those into the conversation. So, for example, let's talk about resistance. It's been a word that's been used, thrown about change for about 3 decades, still hasn't been solved. But if you are attending to the meta process and you're looking beneath the waterline and you're looking at mindsets and you're looking at the default response to change, when you look at it from that lens, resistance is no longer just a challenge to manage, it becomes a signal that
Mm.
leaders can respond to, which makes adoption smoother and more organic. I think most people would kind of understand that. Um, Another way of putting it, I'm just thinking off the cuff, like another potential benefit is, people talk about change resilience a lot, which is very much up in this ongoing disruption scenario. Well, change resilience strengthens if you're working at that level because people develop the mindset and the emotional agility to understand the bigger arc of transformation and stay steady during uncertainties and during setbacks. I would say that's a very tangible benefit. Certainly, it would have been seen as a very tangible benefit in that company I worked with, where change kept getting abandoned.
Mm.
Leaders make better decisions, right? Because they learn to not just react, they learn to pause strategically and respond strategically instead of reacting to every disruption or every setback in the process.
Mm.
You see integration of new behaviors, so change becomes part of the way people work, not just a project. I'm just kind of going through some of the typical benefits. If you're working with unseen issues, just because you're not focusing on them doesn't mean they go away. But when you
Mm.
do focus on them and you surface them early, they get contained before they escalate. And of course, that leads to less derailment. And of course, it also builds trust and engagement because people are seeing that you can have the tough conversations and you're addressing these deeper concerns and subtler dynamics. So you could take all the concerns about change, adoption, resistance, resilience, containment, and you could put a case as to why making the invisible visible helps with that. And the question is really that we should be having those conversations. I'm starting
Mm.
to introduce those conversations into organizations and people get it.
Yeah. And I think, it's, as you said, it's very much, from what I'm hearing, that inner work as well, because you can't really separate change and transformation from individual internal processes and transformation. So, as you mentioned, it's very hard to measure, but
Yeah.
being able to start those conversations and have that awareness makes a big difference, especially amongst leaders, because that's a lot. Leaders do have an outsized role to hold.
They really do. And one of the principles I teach when I talk about the meta process, it's an aspirational principle that when you get right, really does shift the dial with change, is the ability to hold the collective and the individual simultaneously for exactly the
Mm,
reasons that you've just described. Knowing as a leader when it's your work to be doing as an individual and when it's the work of the system, and being able to hold both the individual and the collective and juggle and kind of switch. That's the paradox, switching between what's mine, what's more of an expression of the bigger system that I'm working in, and to toggle between those two realities.
And that's a
Mm,
that's a big step to incorporate into, a leadership toolkit. It's
yes.
how does one learn that, do you think?
Well, I mean, there are various ways you could do that. My preferred mode is dialogue,
Mm.
because what that does is it slows the system down, gets people into a room, gets them to do some real reflection, but also in a group, they can kind of bring that back into the bigger container. So, really, it all goes back to awareness and then
Mm.
commitment, not just awareness, that's part of it, but then really changing, like with that awareness, like how do I show up differently? What do I do differently? How do I hold the self and the system and honor both simultaneously? It's personal work. There is no way around it. You can't change a system without some significant personal transformation at the top levels and all the way throughout.
I could not agree more. Yes. I was just thinking in my head as well, it's almost like a spiral of, the bigger change being the big spiral, but in order to power that spiral, all the individuals in it have their own change processes
Beautiful.
and processes of inner transformation, and that sort of fuels the bigger one and shapes it in terms of how it
Yes.
works.
Yes, there is a principle from ancient wisdom that I'm going to get it wrong, but it talks about the seed of the whole exists in the individual. So I
Ah.
think it was Rumi. There was a quote by Rumi, or maybe, actually not sure. But if you think about like a wave or a wave in the ocean, like the drop of water has its own molecules or whatever, but it holds the pattern and the DNA of the entire ocean. And I'm getting the language wrong, but it's the same with humans in a bigger system. Like you hold the patterning of the system as an individual. And one of the principles I teach is, micro steps have a massive impact. If one leader is starting to show up differently, it's going to create inevitably a ripple effect, starting with the immediate team, then out to the teams they interface with, and before you know it, the system's affected.
And yeah, that's such a big shift from sort of the tools and templates that are quite the norm in the change management space, which are still helpful to shape certain things, but they're not sort of the core change itself.
No, no, they're not. And no, if they're held with awareness, they can be helpful. I always say they create containment because people it's important for people as they're going through the unknown that they can hang whatever they're going through onto something. I think it's a
Yes.
containment action. But if that becomes the be all and end all, which it often does, unfortunately, which is why I'm so passionate about changing all of this, then nothing changes because what you're doing is you're doing change. You're not allowing change to unfold.
Mm.
I went to a conference a few months ago. So it's a change conference. And I don't really typically go into change management, circles because I work in organizational transformation, but not change management per se. But someone invited me and off I went. And I couldn't believe how still, 30 years after I started my career, people are still buying toolkits.
Mm.
They are still selling, and that's the exchange. And it's actually quite fascinating. And then I thought, why is this? And you and I had that chat about it. I mean, one of the reasons is, when things feel overwhelming, people want simplicity, cognitive overload. We spoke about that. Where they want, even if the simple doesn't work, it just kind of makes them feel better in the moment. But I don't think people have been given a viable option. As people talk about stuff, but they're actually not doing change any differently to what they were 30 years ago. I found that quite eye-opening.
Mm. Oh, absolutely. And I think there's still an understanding of what change entails or what change management is or why you might need change management on a project when, at the moment, as we said, we're so far past that we don't I mean, you can have change management on projects if you want, but like change is BAU. We need that whole systems approach and the leadership approach. And I think there's the understanding of what change is and how we can facilitate it is still very much catching up. But also, as you said, that there haven't been alternative options. So it's really exciting to hear people like yourself going into organizations and talking about these alternatives and training people on how to implement them as well. Because
Yeah,
ultimately, it's a tool that people within the organizations need to develop and apply as opposed to a service that can be hired in and of itself to just do it for them. It has
that's
to be
right.
guided and supported.
That's actually right. I'm just going back to the kind of hypothetical question that I asked a little while ago, is like, how do you develop this stuff? And I'm thinking
Yeah.
about my own life and how did I develop the capacity to hold the process of change, to understand what these cycles are and to hold steady in all of that. And it's actually through my own personal transformation journey.
Mm.
I couldn't have learned that through a textbook. I couldn't have learned that even in a 5-day offsite or a 1-year developmental program. I had to go through a process of renewing myself, which I did in 2019 was the catalyst. And in the process of going through a real transformation, I mean, I'm talking about a metamorphosis, I then was able to integrate how change works
Mm.
and bring it with an authenticity and a richness and a depth into the system. So I actually think the only way through to learn it is to go through the process in its rawest form. That's the best way to go through it.
Mm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah,
I really agree. And that shows up in how you can tell as well by how people show up, those who have really been through that their own process themselves.
exactly, exactly. If people have been through a period of upheaval and renewal, you don't just learn about these universal principles, you live them.
Yes.
And then you bring that lived experience, and that makes all the difference. Because it doesn't matter what someone throws at me now, their scenario may be completely different to mine. And I understand how I understand the bigger arc of change. I understand this kind of natural cycle of change, and there's a system to it, and it can be applied anywhere. And I would love nothing more than to teach everyone on the face of this earth that system, because it really does make everything a whole lot easier.
Mm. And as you said, that integration period is so important too, because I like that you highlight that because you can also tell those who've integrated it, and as you said, they live it, it's embodied,
It's embodied.
yeah, and it's
Yeah,
very,
that's
very
exactly right.
powerful when you
I mean,
see it.
as you say, you can sniff it from a mile away when
Yeah.
someone's just talking about something or when someone's actually been through a real process themselves
And embedded it, integrated
and
it in.
embedded it. It's
Yeah.
embodied. I love that word.
Well, actually, this also brings me to one of the words and concepts that you talk about, which is emptiness. And I've referred to it previously as the liminal space, sort of the space in
Mm,
between. and also
Mm.
very much in the personal transformation space. But it is obviously very important in any change process at whatever layer, whatever level. And I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about this period of emptiness in organizational transformation and perhaps personal, and what it is and how we can navigate it, because I think it's also one of those highly uncomfortable, uncertain things that, again, it's so much easier to ignore, but so
It's so much
important.
easier to ignore.
Yeah.
And it's also the default, a lot of the default is to rush things up when it happens because of the discomfort. Uh, where do I start? Okay, so I probably will start by saying, in my experience, emptiness is not really emptiness. I see it as potential. And as you say, spoke about it being the liminal space. It's the void where the old is starting to dissolve before the new has formed. Think of it almost as like an incubation stage. So, you know, and that, as you say, shows up equally in a person's life, which it did in mine in 2019, and professionally when organizations are going through change. What you start to see in that emptiness phase, in that liminal phase, is that the old no longer works. What you've always tried and what has been hugely successful in the past no longer works. So, in an organizational context, strategies may look great on paper, just not getting traction, not being executed. Change, you've always done change in a particular way. It's not happy. It's just not being adopted, in the same way. Familiar ways of working no longer deliver the same outcomes. You might see key people, like talent, leaving the system and creating a space that no one knows how to fill. So it's that really, as you put it, uncomfortable place where you can't go back to the old. You've moved past it. It's been shut off, that tap, but the new is still emerging. So your question is, how do you handle it? Whew. This is really deep stuff, and this is the skill that we go through. It is the challenge is not to rush in and fill the emptiness. It's to hold it. That's what we mean by holding the meta process of change. It's a big part of it. To allow it, to observe what's dissolving. So to observe what's no longer working. To prepare the container for exploration and to trust the timing of the emergence. Because the way that I see it is that what looks like emptiness is actually, I would say, a fertile pause that makes lasting change possible. So that's it in theory. In practice, I'll give you an example of what you could do. Simple things. Yeah, we spoke about micro moments earlier. In a leadership meeting, say you're facilitating it, you're a leader. There's disagreement, there's tension, there's misalignment, things just feel that, you're at an impasse, whatever the case may be. Instead of jumping in prematurely with the direction, I'm not saying leaders don't give direction, they do, but prematurely. What I would recommend is name the tension. Hold it. Hold a short silence and then ask, what do we most need to pay attention to here? Or I'm curious what I'm seeing this or I'm experiencing this. What does it mean for us? That's emptiness in action because you're not just sitting in silence, okay? You're allowing what's surfacing to unfold. That would be an example.
Mm. I love that because sometimes when you talk about holding space, it can sound like, oh, well, I'll just sit back and just let people. But no,
No.
it's actually a very active thing, even though you're not being active necessarily. It's very powerful in the presence, but that the guiding force, like you're influencing the energy of the room in terms of and shaping
Yes.
it and asking questions that are opening up different um,
Yes.
opinions portals that help people move
Yes.
through.
Yes, exactly. And your presence in that moment is not rushed. It's
Mm,
genuine, curious, and it's seeking not necessarily answers, it's seeking understanding before you take the next step.
that,
So that's, transformation is a constant dance between slowing down and speeding up. But before you can speed up, you got to make sure everyone's in alignment, feels right, et cetera, et cetera. And these moments of emptiness is a way of surfacing what needs to surface and be discussed so that you can move forward.
and is this what you would call one of the, because you've talked about like the patterns that block change, would ignoring these kinds of
Yes.
this feedback be one of those things?
Yes. That's a very classic example. It's a great yes in answer to that. That would be a way a practical example. Another practical example was the example I gave earlier, that tendency, that default of that organization to not actually be able to look in the mirror. That was another example of that. Yeah, but typically it's a tendency to ride over these kinds of things. That's a very common one.
Hmm. And in this sort of, there's so much breadth and depth in this conversation, but also in terms of how you perceive and work with organizational transformation. What at the moment is most alive in you, or what you're most focused on in this space?
I think we're talking about it. I mean, the thing that's most alive to me is how do you change and improve this change landscape,
Mm,
I'm really interested in how do you shift the field of change management itself. In fact, I would say I'm not just interested, I'm passionate. It feels like an urgent passion away from being project led, beginning, middle, end, away from being run off a spreadsheet or a traffic light system, and towards systems that can hold complexity and can hold the movement of real transformation. That is just top of mind for me. There are other sub things, but that's the thing I'm most worried about and
mm.
passionate about at the same time.
And so, if there's some key messages, or if there are leaders or managers who are listening to this, obviously shifting change management is, I very much agree with it, and it's a big task. What can individuals do to take away today, tomorrow, in their work and in their individual practice to start applying some of these principles and make those micro shifts in this field and in their organizations?
I think there's a quote that comes up for me. Abraham Maslow, we all know, the Maslow's triangle. And I've got this in one of my reels on my website, but he said this quote, and this applies to the individual. In any given moment, we got two options: to step forward into growth or to step back into safety. The question is, which one are you choosing? So I would leave them with that. That would be a message because, that step can be a micro step or it can be a leap. But a step forward is a step forward. And, are you stepping forward into growth? Or are you stepping back or staying put in safety?
Oh, that's such a beautiful way to tie up everything that we've been talking about. Thank you so much for sharing that. Is there anything else that you would like to leave people with before we wrap up today?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I could talk about this for the rest of the day with you, but I know we're constrained by time. Just a huge thanks to you and also to wish you luck with this new YouTube channel. I've no doubt it'll take off
Thank you
beautifully.
so much, Gabby. And thank you so much for the conversation today. It's always a
Thank you.
pleasure to chat, and I share your passion for these topics. And it's so exciting to see people like yourself putting it in action in organizations across Australia and the world. So thank you.
Thank you so much.